nation, as we know. Let's talk about where we are today with the COVID virus first. The number of hospitalizations are down again. The net change in hospitalizations down again. Intubations down again. Number of new deaths still dropping. All good news. Number of lives lost down to 56, which is, in this absurd reality we live in, actually very, very good news. There'll be a point at which the number of deaths can't get any lower because people will die of something, and COVID virus is very good at affecting those people who have other illnesses. But this reduction in the number of deaths is tremendous progress from where we were. And we have gone through hell and back, but we are on the other side. And it's a lesson for all of us. Last night, as I said, was an ugly night all across this nation. It was an ugly night across this state. We had a number of protests all across the state. New York City, cities upstate. We've seen a lot of disturbing video about the protests, and where I've asked the Attorney General to review the New York City protests and the actions and procedures that were used. I'm going to ask her to include in that review these demonstrations that are ongoing last night, if there are additional demonstrations tonight, and the Attorney General will be reviewing those actions. Upstate New York, we also had actions. We had a significant state police presence all across upstate New York. We have the National Guard on standby. We expect additional protests tonight, and we're preparing for such. Rochester, the county executive, and the mayor asked for additional state police for tonight, and we're going to have 200 additional state police. But look, the big issue is people are outraged, and I understand that. I'm outraged. It's not just George Floyd's killing, although that's enough to outrage a nation. It's George Floyd, it's Ahmaud Arbery, it's Breonna Taylor, all just in the past 3 months. It's 30 years of Rodney King and Amadou Diallo and Sean Bell and Abner Louima, and the same case in states all across this nation, where only the name changes, but the color stays the same. You then had the first press conference by prosecutors looking at the Minneapolis situation that frankly raised more questions than it answered. And the real issue is the continuing racism in this country. And it is chronic, and it is endemic, and it is institutional. And it speaks to a collective hypocrisy. We're very good in this country at telling other people how they should live their lives and how they should act, how we preach a high standard, but we still discriminate on the basis of color of skin. That is the simple, painful truth. But this is a moment for truth. Now, at the same time, it is equally true that violence never works. How many protests have we had? How many nights have we gone through like last night? How many times have we burned down our own businesses, our own neighborhoods, and our own communities? Burning down your own house never works and never makes sense. Burning down your own struggling businesses, people who are trying to bring back the community, never makes sense. It dishonors Mr. Floyd's death. Mr. Floyd was not violent. Mr. Floyd was compliant. Mr. Floyd wasn't even charged or accused of a violent crime. There was no violence. That's what makes the killing more outrageous. When you are violent, it creates a scapegoat to shift the blame. It allows the President of the United States to tweet about looting rather than murder by a police officer. It allows the federal government to politicize what's going on and to come up with theories blaming the left and the extreme left, which only furthers the politics of division. Maya Angelou said, "Hate has caused a lot of problems in the world, but it has not solved one yet." The goal has to be affecting change. How do you use the energy to mobilize people to actually reform society and make things better? And don't tell me that we can't change, because we know we have and we can. Change comes in a moment when the stars line up. It's not easy, but when the stars line up and the people are ready to change, they can change. We have seen it happen in this state and in this nation. We created a new civil right in this nation for the LGBTQ community when we passed marriage equality. And we said we will no longer discriminate when it comes to marriage and telling people who they can love and who they can't love. After the Sandy Hook massacre, when people saw the madness of an assault weapon killing children, we passed common sense gun reform in this state after decades of trying. When we had record income inequality and people said this is enough and enough is enough, that's when we passed free college tuition. And we passed a minimum wage where people can actually live decently. People can change. And we have seen that lesson over the past 92 days as we've been dealing with this coronavirus. Who changed society to deal with this virus? The people did it. 50 days ago, on April 12th, we lost 800 people from COVID. Yesterday, we lost 56. 800 to 56. 60 days ago, we had 3,400 people come into our hospitals. Yesterday, we had 191. Who did that? Who made that remarkable change, that radical change? Who made all that progress? Government leaders? Government did it? No. Let's be honest. Most government leaders denied that COVID was a problem. Most didn't know what to do, and if they knew what to do, they didn't know how to do it. It wasn't government. It was we the people. We the people forced that change and did it in weeks, literally. So of course we can change. And our challenge today is to use this moment, use this energy constructively, and demand real positive change. And articulate what the change is that we want. Be specific. We know what must be done. We know what we can do. We know what should be done. And we know what should be done immediately. Demand that the federal government and every state government pass a law that says allegations of police abuse cannot be investigated by local prosecutors because self-policing does not work, period. Allegations must be investigated by an independent outside agency. Demand that we define excessive force by a police officer by one standard all across this nation so every American lives by the same standard. If a police officer is accused of wrongdoing and is being investigated, release their disciplinary records so people can see what the prior acts of that police officer was. Demand that every public school provide the same level of funding for a child so we don't have 2 education systems in this nation, one for the rich and one for the poor. There is no reason and no excuse today for any child to live in poverty. We know that. Demand that change. And if our government leaders won't do it, or can't do it, or don't know how to do it, then you vote them out. That's how you make change. Most Americans are good, fair-minded, decent, kind, loving individuals. We need to mobilize the best in our people rather than allowing the worst. But don't lose the passion. Don't lose the outrage. Be frustrated. But be smart and be directed and be constructive and destructive. Help your community. Don't hurt your community. Be a laser and focus on real positive change. That's how this moment becomes a different moment in the history books. That's how George Floyd's death does not become just another name in a long list of people who should have never died in the first place. George Floyd must not have died in vain. Mr. Floyd's killing must be a moment in which this nation actually learned and grew and progressed to make this place a better place. And we can do it if we are smart together. Langston Hughes told us the ultimate goal: make America the land that fulfills her promise of greatness for all Americans. That's what this is about. We can do that. We have shown what we can do. Use this moment, use this empowerment, use this mobilization, and use it for good. Use it for good. So that when we look back, we say, yes, this story was all too familiar in some ways. What happened to Mr. Floyd was all too familiar. But the outcome was different. And the outcome was historic. And it was actually a moment of positive change. That has to be our goal. All of us, from the angry young protesters on the street, frustrated, energized, lashing out, to government officials on both sides of the line, to the police officers, 99.9% of them who are good, hardworking people who are trying to help their community. It's a common goal. We just have to be smart enough to get there. Questions?
Governor, last night we saw a lot of videos of NYPD accelerating into a crowd of protesters. There's videos of NYPD officials pulling down the masks of protesters and pepper spraying them, and just violence on both sides. It was NYPD's response to the protests appropriate at this rate, and should the state
White House today in the middle of a growing national crisis? Will he offer any new messages to the nation other than what he's tweeting? Here's our chief White House correspondent, Jonathan Karl.
Today, with the nation gripped by protests and bracing for another night of violence, President Trump remained out of sight, even as crowds gathered anew outside the White House. Overnight protesters, some violent, made their anger known. Hours earlier, the president had invoked images from the darkest moments of the civil rights struggle, tweeting that Secret Service was ready, if needed, to take on protesters with vicious dogs and ominous weapons. He added, "Tonight, I understand, is MAGA night at the White House," seeming to encourage his own supporters to counter-protest, a counter-protest that did not materialize. He later denied that's what he meant.
They love African American people. They love black people. MAGA loves the black people.
The president tried to strike a balance with scripted remarks after the SpaceX launch.
I understand the pain that people are feeling, but what we are now seeing on the streets of our cities
has nothing to do with justice or with peace.
Today, the Senate's only black Republican criticized the president's tweets.
Well, those are not constructive tweets, without any question.
The mayor of Atlanta was even more blunt.
He should just stop talking. This is like Charlottesville all over again. He speaks and he makes it worse. If he can't be silent, if there is somebody of good sense and good conscience in the White House, put him in front of a teleprompter and pray that he reads it and at least says the right things, because he is making it worse.
Outside the White House last night, ABC's Mary Bruce asked college student Ariana Evans her message to the president.
Every time you get on Twitter, every time you say anything, sir, you're saying it out of violence, out of hate. And we are tired of being hated. We are tired of fearing. We are tired of walking out every day and not being sure if we're going to walk back home. We're tired of it. So that's all I want the president to know. I did not vote for you, sir. I don't really care to. If you're still there, I'm going to respect you as our president. That's just what it is. But you need to respect my black life, too. That's all I ask.
The passion and emotion right there. We do have some breaking news. We have John Carl on the phone right now. John, tell me what you're hearing now. Karen Bass, the chair of the Congressional Black Caucus, who represents portions of Los Angeles and LA County, which has declared a state of emergency after protests and violence throughout the city this weekend. Congresswoman Bass, thanks for joining us. I want to share a message you put on Twitter last night as violence escalated. You said, if you're mad, if you're distraught, if you're angry, if you're hurting, fight back against the system that killed George Floyd. Don't destroy our communities and neighborhoods. They want to see us burn. Don't do their work for them. Congresswoman Bass, a lot of Americans did wake up this morning, either in their own cities or watching it on television, to see portions of the country in ruin because of demonstrators who chose violence over peace. How do you break through to those groups? And we know they're small groups, but they're causing a lot of violence and a lot of destruction across this country. How does someone like you break through to these people?
Well, I mean, I think a couple of things. Now, I woke up and I was heartbroken. I was heartbroken to see the destruction around the country. And I think there's a couple of things going on. One, I think that there's a lot of people that are just to their limit. They just can't take it anymore. I mean, we have seen video after video after video, but it breaks my heart because, number one, we're destroying our own communities. And number two, that gets us nowhere. And in fact, it changes the subject so that then the focus is on the violence and it's not on the issue of police accountability and some of the fundamental laws in our country that need to change that essentially never allow for police officers to be convicted and many times even arrested. For example, those other 3 officers should have been arrested immediately on the same day because they facilitated and were complicit in the commission of that crime. So that's my one concern. My other concern is that I do think there's an element that are not demonstrators, that are there intentionally. Back in the day, we called them agent provocateurs. They were there to intentionally create chaos. And we know that there's some conservative elements that are doing that, and there might be some elements from the left. I was disappointed that the president chose to zero in on Antifa. He said, well, actually, he did comment about the protesters in Michigan that came armed from head to toe, that descended upon the state building because they were mad over the public health recommendations. And he said that the governor should go negotiate with them. So I think that the people who are really sincere about changing the laws related to the police, they need to separate themselves from the people who are committing the violence, whether they are protesters that are fed up or whether they are elements that are intentionally there to create chaos.
You know, Congresswoman Bass, I have to ask you, you said this week, quote, it's open season on black folks. Do you still stand by that statement? And I have to ask you, does that kind of rhetoric lead to some of the violence that we see once it gets later at night and once maybe the police can't get control of the situation?
Absolutely not. I have been very clear in everything I have ever said to denounce the violence. But let me tell you what I meant by open season, because you have situations where everybody saw the pool party and they saw all of the people in Kansas who were completely ignoring the public health recommendations. Around the country, you have African Americans who are being cited by police officers, who are being dragged physically off of buses, who are not being allowed to enter places because they had masks on. One of my colleagues in Congress told me about a situation in New York where on one side of the city, police officers saw white sunbathers in a park. They handed them masks. The same city, the same day, on the other side of town, they were giving citations to black and brown folks. People have literally been arrested and put in jail where they're most likely to catch COVID. So when you see a man shot down because he is jogging, when you see a family that didn't garner a lot of attention, they were in their home minding their own business, and a group of angry white folks came to their porch and demanded to search their house. They weren't even law enforcement officers. When you see the woman that was killed while she was asleep, and then when you see George Floyd, you have a sense that it's open season. Now, put on top of that the fact that over 100,000 Americans are dead because of COVID, and a large percentage of those Americans are African American. And so that's why there is a sense in our community amongst African Americans that nobody really cares. That's why the slogan Black Lives Matter is actually a profound slogan, because it's the opposite that I feel we have had to live with for so many years.
What's your message if you could talk to President Trump tonight, if you could sit there in the Oval Office and give him some advice, what would you tell him?
Honestly, I would tell him please not to address the nation. Please don't. That's what I would tell him. What I would like for him to do is to have a message of unity. But for 3.5 years, we have never seen him capable of doing that. The only time he can talk unity is when he's talking to MAGA folks. So I would be fearful, even if he had a script, even if he was talking from a teleprompter, if he does choose to address the nation, I can't imagine him saying anything that is not going to provoke people. How do you think African Americans felt to hear him say, MAGA folks love black people, they love African Americans? It's so insulting. I think that he's not really capable of unifying the nation, and so I would really prefer and advise his silence.
Congresswoman Karen Bass, we appreciate your time, we appreciate your thoughts, and thank you for